Ladies and gentlemen, when the narcissist realizes they've lost you, the first experience is not grief, and it's not love. It's shock, a deep disorienting shock that comes from the sudden collapse of control. For a narcissistic personality, control is not about dominance in the obvious sense. It's about psychological regulation. You were part of the system that helped them manage their self-esteem, their identity, and their sense of superiority. Your presence, your reactions, your emotional availability, these were stabilizers. When you step away, that system falters. What's important to understand is that this shock isn't loud. It often doesn't look dramatic. Many narcissists initially appear calm, detached, even unaffected. That exterior composure is deceptive. Internally, there's confusion. The script they relied on, where you stayed, explained, chased clarity, or absorbed blame, has suddenly stopped working. And for someone whose worldview depends on predictability and power, that loss is profoundly unsettling. This moment challenges one of their core assumptions, that people are interchangeable and endlessly available. Your absence forces a confrontation with a reality they work very hard to avoid, that other people have autonomy, limits, and the capacity to walk away. That realization lands as an ego injury, but before the injury comes the disbelief. They replay conversations. They wait for a reaction. They expect you to return to your role, and when you don't, the silence becomes intolerable. Psychologically, this is where the imbalance begins. Control is not reclaimed through force, but through response, and your lack of response removes their leverage. Philosophically, this moment exposes something fundamental. Narcissism cannot tolerate uncertainty. It requires a fixed hierarchy where they remain central. Your exit destabilizes that structure, even if only temporarily. And here's the part that matters for you. This shock does not mean they suddenly understand your worth or regret their behavior. It means you disrupted a pattern that once kept you small and them comfortable. The moment you choose disengagement over explanation, you shift the power dynamic entirely. When someone loses control over you, they lose access to you, and that is where your freedom begins. After the initial shock fades, what emerges is something far more destabilizing for the narcissist. An ego injury. This is not a bruised feeling or a passing disappointment. An ego injury cuts to the core of how they see themselves. Narcissistic personalities depend on a carefully maintained self-image. Competent, desirable, superior, untouchable. Your departure punctures that image. It introduces a contradiction they are not psychologically equipped to resolve. What makes this moment especially confusing is how little of it is visible. On the outside, they may seem composed, even indifferent. Some appear suddenly confident, upbeat, or dismissive, as if your absence barely registers. That display is not resilience, it's defense. The narcissistic psyche relies heavily on denial and emotional distancing to survive threats to self-esteem. If they acknowledged the hurt openly, they would also have to confront vulnerability, and that is something they were never taught how to tolerate. Internally, however, there is a surge of shame. Not guilt, not remorse, but shame. The feeling of being exposed as inadequate. Being left activates a deep fear of being unimportant, replaceable, or ordinary. Philosophically, this strikes at the illusion of exceptionalism that narcissism depends on. If someone can walk away without collapsing, then perhaps the narcissist was never as powerful as they believed. To manage this injury, the mind searches for external explanations. Blame becomes essential. You are reframed as unstable, disloyal, ungrateful, or cruel. This reframing is not about truth, it's about survival. Accountability would require them to sit with the discomfort of self-examination, and for many narcissists, that discomfort feels annihilating. This is why expecting emotional insight or sincere closure at this stage often leads to disappointment. Ego injury does not produce empathy, it produces defensiveness. The more grounded and self-contained you become, the more exposed they feel. Your calm becomes evidence of their loss, and that is deeply threatening. For you, the lesson is clear. Their emotional collapse is not your responsibility, and their inability to self-reflect is not your failure. When you stop trying to be understood by someone who is invested in misunderstanding you, you reclaim your energy, and that is the beginning of real healing. Once the ego injury takes hold, a powerful urge often follows, the need to reassert dominance. This is the point where many people feel confused because the narcissist's behavior can suddenly shift. After silence, distance, or apparent indifference. There may be unexpected contact, a kind message, a nostalgic memory, a crisis that requires your attention. These moments can feel meaningful, even hopeful, but psychologically they serve a very specific function: to restore control. For a narcissistic personality, dominance is not about connection, it's about regulation. When you are emotionally available, your reactions help stabilize their inner world. Losing that access creates discomfort, and the fastest way to soothe it is to pull you back into orbit. This is why re-engagement attempts are rarely direct or honest. Instead, they are designed to bypass your rational boundaries and activate your emotional reflexes: empathy, guilt, responsibility, or longing. Philosophically, this is where power becomes visible. Power is not held by the person who reaches out, it's held by the person who can tolerate not responding. Narcissists struggle deeply with this asymmetry. When they no longer provoke a reaction, they experience it as loss of status. That's why attempts to reassert dominance may escalate. The behavior becomes more dramatic, more provocative, or more performative, not because they care more, but because the old strategies have stopped working. This stage is also where people often second-guess themselves. You may wonder if you misjudge them, if you're being unfair, if this time is different. That self-doubt is not accidental. It reflects how thoroughly you were trained to prioritize their emotional needs over your own clarity. The urge to explain, defend, or seek closure is often strongest here, precisely when it is least helpful. Psychologically, engaging at this stage reopens the loop. Even a neutral response can be interpreted as access regained. Disengagement, by contrast, forces the narcissist to confront a reality they resist, that they cannot control another person's autonomy. And this is where your agency matters most. You don't reclaim power by winning an argument or being understood. You reclaim it by choosing not to participate in a dynamic that required you to abandon yourself. The moment you stop responding to manipulation is the moment dominance shifts for good. When attempts to regain control fail, the narcissist's focus often shifts inward, not toward reflection, but toward rewriting the story. This is where the narrative changes. The loss of you must be explained in a way that preserves their self-image, and so reality becomes negotiable. What actually happened matters far less than how it can be framed. In this revised version, they are reasonable, misunderstood, even generous. You, on the other hand, become difficult, unstable, demanding, or disloyal. Psychologically, this rewriting serves a protective function. Accepting responsibility would require the narcissist to tolerate guilt, humility, and emotional complexity, states that feel intolerable to a fragile ego. By reshaping the narrative, they restore internal equilibrium. The mind says, I didn't lose them, I escaped them, or they were never good enough anyway. These stories are not lies in the traditional sense. They are survival mechanisms designed to avoid psychological collapse. This process often extends beyond private thought. Friends, family, colleagues, even strangers may be recruited as an audience. The narcissist becomes the curator of perception, selectively sharing details that validate their version of events. This can be deeply unsettling for those who live the reality, especially if you recognize yourself in none of the accusations being made. The temptation to correct the record can be overwhelming. Philosophically, this is a confrontation with truth versus peace. The narcissist chooses peace at the cost of truth, while you are left holding the truth without validation. That imbalance can feel unjust, and it often triggers the urge to defend yourself. But understanding the purpose of the rewrite changes how you respond to it. This narrative is not meant to be debated, it is meant to be believed by the person telling it. The most destabilizing response is not confrontation, but consistency. When you stop participating in the narrative, when you refuse to argue your character, explain your boundaries, or perform your pain, you remove the fuel that keeps the story alive. Over time, the rewrite loses momentum because it no longer serves its regulatory purpose. You don't need to be correctly portrayed to be free. You need to be grounded in your reality and unwilling to trade it for someone else's comfort. The moment you stop auditioning for their version of you is the moment your life truly begins to move forward. When the rewritten narrative can no longer fully stabilize them, the narcissist often turns outward in a more visible way, the search for replacement supply. This is the phase where their life may suddenly look busy, exciting, even enviable. New relationships appear quickly. Social media fills with smiles, achievements, and declarations of happiness. To the outside world, it can seem as though they moved on effortlessly while you're left processing the emotional aftermath. That contrast can be deeply destabilizing if you don't understand what's actually happening. Psychologically, this search is not about connection or healing. It is about anesthesia. Narcissistic supply functions as an external regulator, numbing the discomfort created by loss, shame, and uncertainty. Attention, admiration, and novelty temporarily restore the sense of self that was disrupted when you left. The speed with which this replacement occurs is not a sign of resilience, it's evidence of dependence. Stillness would require introspection, and introspection would expose wounds they are unwilling to face. Philosophically, this reveals a profound difference between attachment and autonomy. Healthy relationships can tolerate pauses, endings, and grief because the self remains intact. Narcissistic attachment, by contrast, collapses without constant reinforcement. That's why the replacement is often exaggerated or performative. The goal is not intimacy, but proof. Proof that they are desired, winning, and unbothered. If you're watching from the outside, it can feel like erasure, as if your shared history meant nothing. This is where self-protection becomes essential. Interpreting their new supply as evidence of your inadequacy is a misunderstanding that keeps you emotionally tethered. What you're seeing is not your replaceability, it's their inability to be alone with themselves. The cycle continues because it has to. Without supply, the inner void becomes too loud. Your work at this stage is quiet but profound. Resist the urge to compare, to monitor, or to decode. Each glance backward pulls you into a system you already exited. Healing does not require you to be chosen again. It requires you to choose yourself consistently. Someone who rushes to replace you has not replaced the pattern that cost them you. And the moment you stop measuring your worth against their distractions is the moment your recovery truly begins. Eventually, something shifts that the narcissist cannot negotiate, reinterpret, or replace. The realization that you are no longer reachable. Not emotionally, not psychologically, not through memory, guilt, or provocation. This moment does not arrive with drama. It arrives quietly, and that is precisely why it is so destabilizing. Silence, when it is rooted in clarity rather than fear, becomes a boundary they cannot cross. For the narcissist, this realization touches a deep existential nerve. Attention has always been a form of confirmation, a way to feel real, significant, and anchored in the world. When your attention is gone, it is not simply absence, it is irrelevance. And irrelevance is one of the most threatening states for a narcissistic personality. There is no role for them to play, no reaction to manage, no image to curate in your emotional space. You have exited the system entirely. Psychologically, this is where their influence ends. Without access to you, their internal strategies lose effectiveness. There's no mirror reflecting ion or resistance, no emotional charge to regulate their sense of self. What remains is a void they cannot fill externally. This is why, at this stage, some narcissists appear restless, agitated, or unusually withdrawn. Others double down on distraction. Very few turn inward in a meaningful way because doing so would require confronting the self without defenses. Philosophically, your unreachability represents autonomy in its purest form. You are no longer defined in relation to them, not as victim, partner, adversary, or lesson. You simply are. That neutrality is what makes this moment so powerful. You are no longer reacting to the past, you are acting in the present. This is also where closure becomes unnecessary. Closure is often a conversation we seek with someone else. Resolution, by contrast, is a decision we make with ourselves. When you stop waiting for understanding, apology, or acknowledgement, you step out of suspension and into agency. And this is the final truth to carry with you. When someone no longer has access to your inner world, they no longer have power over your life. Your peace is not something you receive, it is something you protect. And the moment you do, everything changes. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe, my friends.